Good day, beautiful people. This is Natalie Silva with Life, Treasures, and Golden Moments. Welcome to my podcast on the happenings of true miracles along with inspirational stories. It is my hope that these stories will uplift and inspire you as you travel through your life's journey in this amazing world that we have all been blessed to share. One of life's special blessings is the love and companionship of God's creatures, the animals we love. They bring joy, laughter, comfort, and love and devotion to their master and ask for nothing in return. They are truly one of God's special gifts to us. Today's story is called Paying It Forward by Holly Baxley. There he was, a cute little guy, lying in the sunny patch of light that filtered through the canopy of live oak branches overhead. With one pink padded paw in the air, his eyes were closed, and his upturned face seemed to wrinkle back in a smile, revealing two sharp little canine teeth. The only movement besides the occasional puff of wind that circled through the leaves was one ear that twitched through the tickling breeze. He seemed to own the porch he was lying on, looking for all practical purpose like he didn't have a care in the world. There was one problem, though. It wasn't his porch or his patch of sunlight, not even his live oak tree. But Holly doubted she could tell him that. As Holly quietly started up the sidewalk to her house, she wondered how this peaceful puffball ended up at her home. Her next-door neighbor hollered out, "He's a pretty one, isn't he?" Startled by the voice breaking the silence, both the cat and Holly looked up in the direction of the voice. She smiled back at her neighbor and agreed. "Yes, he is beautiful," Holly said. "Where did he come from?" "Can't say. Just showed up this morning," the neighbor replied. "I named him Snowball." Holly looked back at the still reclining cat. He was staring back at her with his warm blue eyes. He was very beautiful. He shook his head to get the remaining tickle out of his ears, stretched all four legs as far as they could go, and then reclined back into a heap on the porch. Holly sighed. Her husband and she had no pets of their own. Not as yet, anyway. That was by choice. They were a young married couple in college, and there was hardly any finances of their own to keep themselves fed, let alone feed a cat, because they lived on Roman noodles and a 5-pound sack of beans that Holly's sister had given her as a housewarming present when they moved into the off-campus housing. They had no way of affording any kind of pet or any food, so they told themselves a pet was out of the question. And yet, the cat's little ribs could be seen underneath his thin coat of fur. He probably wouldn't be picky, Holly reasoned in her head. But she seriously doubted that this cat would enjoy a dinner with noodles, even the ones with chicken flavoring. Her neighbor spoke as if reading Holly's thoughts. "He really enjoyed the leftover pieces I gave him from the catfish I caught today while I was fishing. I caught a beauty. Are you going to keep him?" Holly asked hopefully. Her neighbor looked at the cat fondly. "I don't think he's really the keeping kind, if you ask me. I think he likes his freedom, but I'm sure between us we can keep him fed." And that is how Snowball came to own Holly and her neighbor on the little street of Avenue D. He spent his mornings at the neighbor's house enjoying whatever this happened to be. Holly's neighbor was an avid fisherman who went out in the wee hours of the morning to fish. Then if he caught something, he would bring it back and string it up on the backyard line to fillet. Snowball was always ready and waiting in the backyard before the neighbor got home, staring up at those hooks that he knew a fat fish would soon be swinging from. After breakfast, Snowball was off for whatever the day held for him. Then returning in the late afternoon, Holly would get back from her classes to find him chasing the patch of sunlight on their porch and laying square in the center of soaking up all the sweet warmth. Holly and her husband managed to finagle their finances just enough to add a small bag of cat food to their grocery bill, and fed Snowball when he was hungry, and their neighbor friend lures were empty that day. The arrangement worked out quite well, actually. Snowball seemed to enjoy it most of all. He wasn't pressured to be owned, and Holly and her husband and neighbor were not pressured to own him. And somehow, through this process, everyone became closer as neighbors as well. But one day, Snowball needed an owner more than he needed freedom. Holly and her husband woke up one morning to find a very sick Snowball on their front porch. It was unusual enough to find him lying on their porch in the morning, but things were far worse than that. Snowball had been in a fight, a very, very bad fight. His left ear was almost torn off, and he was bleeding quite profusely. Their neighbors were gone, and time was of the essence. Brent, Holly's husband, quickly picked up the almost limp kitty and laid him in his usual semicircle on his arms. Snowball didn't move, but he did purr. Brent transferred Snowball into Holly's arms, deftly cleaned his wounds, then wrapped his head in an ace bandage. They thought he would struggle against it, but it seemed as if he had no fight left in him, and that scared them. They took turns talking to him from evening till late at night. They created a little bed for him beside their dryer on their enclosed back porch, and put out some food and some water. Snowball laid exactly where they put him and made no effort to move. They went to bed that night wondering if they did the right thing and if they had done all that they could. The next morning they peeked over the kitchen door. Snowball was standing over his water ball, just trying to lap the water the best he could from the restrictive bandage around his head. And then they heard him growl as he tried to paw at the wound by his ear. That made them grin, as they knew it was a good sign to see him a little put out by his circumstances. As Brent and Holly got ready to leave for their respective classes, they noticed the neighbor had his latest fish conquest on a line out back. But it didn't matter, as Mr. Stanley was walking around his yard looking for his little white fur pal. Brent told him what had happened and pointed at their back porch. Mr. Stanley said that Snowball was lucky to have someone watch over him and his 9 lives, and promised to save some fish for him. In the afternoon, Snowball was lying once again in the sunny patch of light, this time on top of the dryer. But as soon as he saw Holly and Brett peeping at him through the back door window, he started meowing loudly and fighting his bandage. They opened the door, and he came streaking through the kitchen. His normally white, skinny tail was as thick as a bottle brush, held up rigidly straight up in the air, not as a white flag of surrender, but as a banner raised declaring war. He howled, he towed, and growled, while running through every room of their small rented house. Every once in a while he would stop to fight the ominous bandage that seemed to bend on breaking his will, like a prize fighter using a light footwork while dancing around the ring. Snowball would stand on his hindquarters, weaving and bobbing and clawing at the dressing. He would not yield to the bandages. Power over him, nor would he stop his crusade to rid himself of the evil thing. He would fight to the bitter end. Then he heard the can opener open. Upon hearing the mechanical whirl, he stopped his one-cat campaign, sheathed his claws, and padded back to the kitchen, dragging half of the bandage behind him. A victory dinner of tuna and milk awaited him. Holly and Brett figured he had worked too hard to settle for those noodles with chicken flavoring. When you get a full-time job, he became more docile. Brent picked him up once again, medicated his ear, and applied a fresh bandage, much to Snowball's chagrin. But if he had been put out with Holly and Brent, Snowball was just as quick to forgive, for the evening found him lying in the familiar semicircle on the couch between Brett and Holly as they studied. His eyes were closed, and he was purring. And that was the moment, the magical moment, that something happened deep within their hearts. They fell in love with him. He had weaved and bobbed his way into their hearts with his bravery and his courage. they found that they wanted more than just a casual acquaintance with him. Holly scratched him under his chin, the only place the bandage didn't restrict him. His purr got louder and deeper. Fish might get hooked on Holly and Brent's neighbor's line, but Snowball had them hooked with that loud, precious purr. All of a sudden, Snowball looked up at Holly, his eyes peering into hers. He winked as if he knew something of a great secret. They thought he personally could see how much they wanted him to become a permanent part of their family. He leaned his head further into Holly's hand to be scratched for a mere minute, and then just as quickly he leaped down and made his way through the kitchen to the back porch on his bed. Holly thought it was rather abrupt, but then she was still learning his ways. Holly had owned dogs for most of her life, but she didn't know how a cat acted and responded, and to this day Holly couldn't tell anyone why he did things the way he did. But she thought about it a lot since first meeting Snowball. Perhaps he went to bed that night so soon because he was worn out from his battle with the bandage. Perhaps he was just ready to be alone for the night. But Holly honestly thought that getting close with them was too much for his freedom and his loving heart, and he didn't want to get too close to anyone who wanted to own him. The next few days, he'd repeat the above antics in a much smaller version. Every day after class, Holly and Brent would let him out. He'd run like a crazed cat for a little bit, then he'd eat his food, let them undress and redress his wound. But when it came time for Brent and Holly to study, instead of hanging out with them, he headed back to the back porch, and then he would meow to be let out. The first night he did that, Holly and Brent ignored his cries because he was too banged up to be let out. But the next night his cries got louder and louder and angrier. So Brent took pity on him and let him outside. Holly was afraid that they would never see him again. But in the morning he was back in his bed sleeping soundly. He must have been up all night. The next evening he was let out again, and when he woke up he was happy eating fish next door. Holly and Brent caught him and took off his bandage for the last time, as his ear was healing nicely. After school, when Holly arrived home, he was once again looking like the old Snowball, curled up on their front porch in his patch of sunlight. That evening he came inside and ate some cat food and hung out with Holly and Brent. He kept staring at them with some kind of far-off look that they could not read. It was as if he was trying to see through Holly and Brent, trying to make up his mind about who they were as people. He cried to be let outside. They watched him saunter out the door and wander off into the night. They didn't know if they would ever see him again. The next morning, Holly and Brent looked for Snowball at their neighbor's, but he wasn't there. Brent went back and walked to the back porch to see if he was sleeping in his bed. And that is when Holly heard Brent call out, "Holly, Holly, come quick! You've got to see this!" Holly ran back to the porch, wondering if Snowball had gotten in a worse fight, but what she found amazed her as well. There in Snowball's bed was the finest lawn-furred orange kitten, with eyes they were barely open. This baby was too tiny to have been weaned from his mother, and there was no way he could have made his way all by himself, even up their back porch steps, let alone into Snowball's bed. His baby blue eyes peeped up at Brent and Holly, and his tiny mouth opened as if to meow, but no sound came out, not even a tiny squeak. Brent and Holly stared at each other in wonder as they tried to connect the dots of how this very thin and tiny precious kitten came to them. Later that evening, when there was no Snowball to be seen, they did their best to make their new baby welcome in their home. And then Brent said, "I know what happened. Snowball didn't want to be owned. He knew that Holly and Brent wanted to own a pet. He also knew they took care of him when he was sick. So he found this kitten that needed both a home and a way to be taken care of. Holly and Brent thought that Snowball decided to help this kitten, to help him out in the way that he had been helped." Many years later, Holly and Brent learned the term, "pay it forward," which meant when a stranger provided a random act of kindness, do a random act of kindness for someone else. Snowball was ahead of the curve. He knew how to pay it forward, long before the term was ever coined, and each of us have been learning that lesson ever since. Sometimes we as humans think we are the only ones for and through God that performs wonderful miracles, but not always. He will sometimes call on all of his creatures, no matter how great or how small, to bring a miracle. This is Natalie Silva with Life's Treasures and Golden Moments. Until next time, wishing each of you a blessed day filled with unexpected miracles, and please remember to pay it forward. If you have a story of inspiration or of a miracle that has touched you in your life or someone else's that you would like to share, please contact me at angelswhispers11@gmail.com. That's angelswhisper11@gmail.com.